Thanks, Greg, for the nice introduction. Hi, everyone. Again, my name is Martin. I'm from Saarland University and the FKI in Germany. But first of all, thanks for making it back from the coffee break. I really appreciate it because I know how difficult this can be from personal experience. Today, I want to talk about hand-based illusions in virtual reality, which are very powerful. For example, allowing a single physical proxy object, in this case, a 3D printed bunny that you can see on the very top, to provide touch feedback for multiple virtual bunnies. But how does the technique work? Well, at the very fundamental level, we basically introduce an offset between the real and the virtual world, like you can see here. We can gradually speed up the virtual hand by applying a CD gain factor. However, there exist several ways on how to introduce offsets, which can be summarized as hand redirection techniques. However, offsetting proprioceptive from visual sensory inputs comes at the risk of disrupting the immersive nature of the VR experience, because something unexpected is happening. So how can we ensure that the offset remains unnoticeable to users? So the current state of the art is to run a psychophysical experiment where we repeatedly expose participants to hand redirection offsets of different magnitudes, basically asking them if they noticed it or not, eventually arriving at something like a detection threshold. So now you might ask yourself, there is already a way to do this? Why I'm even here today? Well, there is a large body of work that found these conservative lower bounds to be highly individual, both in terms of user sensitivity to detect it, but also depending on the interaction. So for example, movements in the depth axis have much higher thresholds than in the horizontal. Thresholds can also not be seen as fixed values because users can adapt to them. They increase under higher cognitive load and if users are unaware of their presence. So there is really a need for a method that allows continuous monitoring of user sensitivity, giving the VR experience and dynamically adapt to it. But what could be potential variables that can predict noticeable, in our case, hand redirection? So if we compare normal aimed reaching movement, like you can see here, versus reaching movement under the influence of noticeable hand redirection, we can observe a clear correction phase there. So not just in movement trajectory, but also in the velocity profile. Thus, we included this measure in our investigation to understand if it can be used as a distinct marker for different magnitudes of hand redirection. So next we looked at the eye gaze literature, especially the behavior during aimed hand movements, where users generally spend the majority of the time looking at their virtual target. It took me 30 minutes to do this animation. In contrast, we hypothesized that this changes around the detection threshold because they might notice the discrepancy in their peripheral view and thus their focus shift on the position of the hand, which you can see in a second. There you go. Resulting in them looking at their hand more frequently and for longer duration, marking the second modality we were interested in. And third and final are EEG data, more specifically event-related potentials in the frontal cortex area, which Pataro and colleagues showed to respond to strong body movement violations. So in their study, users moved their real hand to the left, for example, and their virtual hand would move in the opposite direction, evoking strong error-related potentials. And last year, we already presented a paper at IEEE VR that confirmed the potential of ERPs to detect strong hand redirection, which in contrast to previous work, did not completely violate body semantics, but amplified real-world movements. And in this work, we go one step further by trying to understand whether ERPs also occur around the noticeability level and if they can be used to distinguish different magnitudes of hand redirection. So we designed a two-part experiment where in the first part, we determined each participant's ability to detect hand redirection by conducting a psychophysical experiment using the method of stimuli, so what we usually do. So basically, we expose participants to hand redirection offsets of different magnitudes, asking them to report if they noticed it. Thus, we fit a psychometric function to these discrimination results for each individual, resulting in this, for human perception, typical S-shaped curve. So here we see that hand redirection offsets on the x-axis and the probability to detect it on the y-axis, telling us that small offsets remain unnoticeable and larger offsets are easy to detect. So based on this psychometric function, we can extract perceptual points, starting with the baseline, which is not super interesting, but next the conservative detection threshold, or the point of subjective equality at 50% probability of detection. So at this point, it's pretty much random if an individual notices the offset or not. And then we have the detection threshold at 75% of a correct response, and these two, so at and above, are the most commonly used in the literature. We also defined the 25% value below the detection threshold, but that's not defined in the literature, so that was just for us to see whether we can actually model this entire S-curve. So once we established these perceptual boundaries for each user, we moved on to part 2 of the experiment, and here we only exposed participants to hand redirection offsets corresponding to their perceptual boundaries over 8 rounds of a continuous reaching task, while collecting movement, eye gaze, and EEG data. So in both parts, we used a 2-interval forced choice task, meaning that participants performed 2 consecutive hand movements. Is the video playing? Yeah. So one without hand redirection that you can see right now, and then another one with horizontal hand redirection. And their task was to compare both movements and detect if hand redirection was applied by responding to this forced choice question, either with yes or no. So we recruited 18 participants for our study, and we had the following measures. So of course, in part 1, we collected discrimination results. In part 2, we collected this total movement time, transition points between ballistic and correction phase in the time and spatial domain. For eye gaze, we computed the number of hand fixations and their duration. And for EEG, we specifically looked at ERPs at the frontal cortex. In the paper and the supplementary materials, we outline how we extracted all these features, including all the events we used, and we also described the post-processing pipeline. So now I would like to come to the results. So first, of course, we obtained these perceptual boundaries for each individual user that you can see up there, and then we ensured that they are actually significantly different given our experimental design, which was the case. In the next step, we then verified that participants' discrimination performance over the 8 rounds remained consistent to ensure that fatigue did not play a role, because participants had to perform 250 reaching movements, so quite a lot. But of course, also it didn't affect their performance in discriminating. And then we finally looked at the movement data. So here is an example of how the velocity profiles between no hand redirection on the left and above the detection threshold can differ. So above the detection threshold, we can see this short ballistic phase followed by a long correction phase. And we statistically analyzed these features and found that both movement time and transition points can be used to distinguish between perceptually different magnitudes of horizontal hand redirection. So that's good news. Next, we looked at the eye gaze features that also showed significant differences, especially between the baseline and at the detection threshold and the baseline and above the detection threshold. However, the effect was in the opposite direction to our hypothesis, which may result from the task itself, because participants focused on the hand to detect these differences, right? That was the task. And as soon as they noticed it, they kind of went back to their normal eye gaze behavior that is described in the literature. So future work needs to look into this. And then we looked at ERPs, especially their negativity, and found that there exists some evidence that suggests that we can distinguish baseline movements from movements under the influence of hand redirection. However, we did not find evidence that would allow us to differentiate between hand redirection of different magnitudes, such as at and above the detection threshold. We also performed a spectral analysis of the EEG data that you can find in the paper, showing similar results. Finally, we combined all 3 modalities by training a 4-stage multi-model classifier using a random forest out of the box without any hyperparameter tuning, achieving an overall prediction accuracy of about 40% for all 4 classes based on a single trial across all participants. And while this does not sound impressive at first, we need to consider that below, at, and above are not distinct events, right? They are small changes in the magnitude of hand redirection that especially in case of below, the detection threshold remains completely unnoticeable to users. So it's unconscious pretty much. To summarize, our method performs quite well in distinguishing normal movements from hand redirection offsets above the detection threshold, while at the detection threshold shows promising results. The method could further be improved by training the classifier on an individual level instead of across all participants, and by using much more advanced learning methods. To support this, we also open sourced all our data and the learning pipeline. And of course, like with any other experiment, we really suffered from the lack of data here. For example, we would have loved testing this on users that are not aware of the technique, for example. And with this, I would like to thank my co-authors, Cora, Lucas, Andre, Tony, Tobias, Maurice, and Antonio for the super fun collaboration on this really beast of a project. And at the same time, this also concludes my PhD research from the last 4.5 years. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions.